Before I make the introductions, I'd like to just recognize Dr. Gail King, who's in charge of our Asian Studies department here in the library. Gail, where are you sitting, and would you stand, please? Thank you. Gail was the chair of the exhibits committee for this exhibit. And Eric Howard, are you here, Eric? He's still putting things in the exhibit, maybe. But Eric Howard is the architect, designer, and installer of the exhibit. And I'm sure as you look at the exhibit, you'll appreciate his handiwork and his creativity. Our speakers today are Dr. Paul Hyer, Dr. Jack Stoneman, and Dr. Aaron Scablin. All friends and colleagues, and I'm happy to make these introductions. I am told that I am to introduce to you Dr. Hyer as the Indiana Jones of the Mormon Church. Dr. Hyer is Emeritus Professor of Chinese History at BYU and the founder of BYU's Asian Studies program. He was born in 1926 in Ogden and served in World War II in the Pacific. And he also served a mission for the LDS Church in Hawaii, and that was Japanese speaking. Without purser script, okay, well. His degrees include a BA in History from BYU in 1951, an MA in Asian History and Asian Social Institutions from UC Berkeley in 1953, and a PhD in Asian History from Berkeley in 1961. He has published on the history of Inner Mongolia, Japanese-Tibetan relations, and Mongolian life and history. And after his retirement, Dr. Hyer taught English for 3 years in China. Our second speaker will be Dr. Jack Stoneman, who is assistant professor in the BYU Department of Asian and Near Eastern Languages. He holds a BA from BYU, an MA from Columbia, and a Master's of Philosophy from Columbia as well, and a PhD from Columbia. He spent a lot of time at Columbia and finally graduated in 2006. His research interests include Japanese poetry, prose and drama, and Asian art history. And he has previously curated an exhibit on Zen teacups here in the library in 2008. So he's got some experience with this and exhibiting. Dr. Aaron Scablin is my biking buddy. We run herd on the bikers at BYU and try to make sure they're not running down people on campus, and they get their rights and privileges to park where they need to park and go where they need to go on campus as well. So he specializes in modern Japanese history and with an emphasis on social and cultural history of imperialism, animals, and the military. That's an interesting combination, Aaron. He holds a PhD in modern Japanese history from Columbia as well. And that was granted in 2004. In 2004 to 2006, Aaron held a postdoctoral fellowship at the Japanese Society for the Promotion of Science at Hokkaido University. And he has been here at BYU since 2006. And he's the author of numerous articles on the 20th century Japanese history, and his current research interests include the relationship of the Japanese self-defense force with the society, the U.S. military, and with the imperial military. So we will turn the time over to Dr. Hyer to begin our presentations.
I'm especially grateful to Gail King for this invitation and for your attendance. I got involved in part because I was in the war with the Japanese in the Pacific, just out of Pearl Harbor, training pilots to land on aircraft carriers. Later, mission, kind of pioneer mission, training some of the first ones to go to Japan. My work at the university has generally been modern China. But I'm glad to talk about one of my favorite old subjects of Japanese feudalism that I've always been interested in. I have to follow some notes because they give us only 15 minutes. Can you imagine all we can say in 15 minutes? Some of you perhaps have seen the samurai suit on the main floor. I obtained that in Japan. I was doing some research there for a year, and my old companion, mission companion in the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, Ted Price, introduced me to a man who had been in a Japanese spy agent in Mongolia and in Tibet for 10 years. I was helping him with a book, and so he gave me that samurai suit. It looks 100% better now than it did when I had it in an old beat-up box. Now, that samurai suit, of course, is pre-modern Japan. Pre-modern Japan was a feudal society, fragmented, many petty states, and if we see if we can find, maybe I've got some. Here's Japan, and this samurai suit comes from the southernmost island of Kyushu. Not a very good picture, but that's the best we've got. And Kimura Hisao came from Kyushu, as did many agents who were all over Kimura and Mongolia, and I said 10 years in Japan. And then those feudal wars then, and U.S., in our society, we like Western cowboy movies with Clint Eastwood and the like. In Japan, it's samurai films. Like to see those great samurai and some of their exploits. Now, there were many feudal wars then, and the political center of Japan was Kyoto, with the emperor kind of cloistered there, not very much really involved, and then later in Kamakura, and finally in Tokyo about 1600, when the Tokugawa clan unified Japan and established their base there. That samurai suit comes from Kyushu. I mentioned on the bottom there, and the southernmost line. And that was an interesting place because from Kyushu, you see, it's closest to Korea, so that some of those samurai even went on some of their expeditions into Korea. Eventually, Japan owned the place for about 50 years, and into China from that area. It was an interesting place. Now, Kyushu then in the south was the dominant clan. As I recall, Shimazu clan they also controlled Okinawa south of there, that you can't see very well on the map. But this feudal society then was a hierarchical society. You can see the top emperor, not very important, but then some samurai in the middle, and a super samurai and a daimyo kind of leading some of these groups, and eventually in certain periods of Japan, a generalissimo, could we call him, of the shogun. Now, this feudal society was a hierarchical society, you can see. The dominant group was samurai, and we can see here again same thing with the peasants, merchants, others on the bottom, and the samurai plus the hierarchy going up. Now, you can see the armor worn by the samurai, the daimyo, and the Japanese armor was different from European armor. It was lighter, flexible, more efficient. It was lacquered bamboo, often tied together by different fabrics, silk and others. And then this was very efficient against, very effective against arrows and often swords in some case, until the modern period when Western arms, rifles, guns were introduced in Japan, and it was not then very effective against those that kind of things. The European armor was metal, rigid, cumbersome, hard to get into, hard to get out of. You've seen some of that, and so it was very different what European knights wore. Knights that you remember were in the Crusades and dominant during the medieval period in Europe, with again those petty wars and problems in the area. Now, this Japanese armor then was interesting, and you can see on the main floor what a samurai suit looked like. The library had done a wonderful job making it look good. It looked pretty ragged when I brought it from Japan, from Hisao Kimura, who I repeat had been in Tibet as an agent for 10 years, and I worked with on a publication he was preparing. Now the modern period was very different. We had a period of imperialism. The have-nots of Europe, I call them, the British, the Dutch, the Portuguese, small areas with not very many resources. They were out on the world, scrounging around, in the British in India, the French in Vietnam, and Indochina, and the Dutch in Indonesia, and the Japanese were observing this development. And so those samurai, they knew what they were looking at when they saw what was happening by Europeans scrounging around and taking over those places, subordinating them. So Japan adopted a policy of isolation. Nobody goes out, nobody comes in. It didn't work often. Still, some people from Kyushu went out and became involved in, I repeated, in Korea and China. And so this isolation, but generally it was quite effective. Japan by that time was centralized. The Tokugawa had come to dominate and unify essentially Japan with their headquarters in Tokyo from about 1600. Now this feudal period, mind you, extended over hundreds of years from maybe the 5th, 6th century on to modern times, until finally U.S. Admiral Perry came to Japan and forced Japan's isolation open. He needed, I think, some resources or some products for his fleet, and he came into Japan and threatened them, and they forced then the opening for a new era in Japan. The end of samurai suits in many ways, as guns were introduced, and Japan became a very different place. Now, so there were some progressive samurai leaders who knew what they were looking at when they saw what was happening in other parts of Asia and the imperialism of Europeans, and Perry and Japan and others. The Dutch established themselves in an island just off of, see if I can make this work. Here's a samurai suit. You can get an idea how much different it looks than European metal. And this is a good example. They're often very attractive, very impressive. And what Gayle King and the group have done to this suit that I gave the librarian, and you'll see on the floor, on the ceremony floor. You can see on the front here the thing on top of the helmet that was useful to show rank, and can't see it. Well, here's a good man to pick it up. Now, some of these samurai leaders who went abroad and opened Japan, they saw with this threat that they, after Japan began to see that they had to change and abolish, as it were, feudalism, have a unified nation, and to develop their own resources. They sent a group abroad. Some of these were from Kyushu, where the some suit that I was interested came from. This is the end. We'll leave that till later. And a group of them, I think about, I don't know, a couple of dozen, came into Salt Lake. They were snowed in, and they were kind of lodged in Salt Lake for about 2 weeks, and became well acquainted with Brigham Young and others. One of the canon leaders of the church, a canon, I forget his his friend is here in our ward, John Cannon, I forget his name. He traveled east with Ito Hirobumi, who became, as I recall, the first prime minister of a new Japan after it was unified, after samurai, after feudalism was gone, and Japan was beginning to become a modern nation. Ito traveled east with Brother Cannon, and they had an advisor who said, these Mormons are great at developing new areas. Hokkaido, in northernmost area of Japan, is undeveloped, and we ought to get these Mormons, a group of them, to come to Japan and develop Hokkaido. That didn't happen, but that sounded good. And later on, Ito was important in inviting missionaries to come. 1901, Heber J. Grant, as many of you know, came to Japan as with a group of the first missionaries. They were there till about 1914. And then Japanese nationalism that was becoming strong and actually becoming threatening and concerned about aliens and so forth. Japan, or the church, opted out in about 1924, transferred work to the Japanese group in Hawaii that I was involved with. It was the largest ethnic group in Hawaii at the time. Now, if you remember anything of this, of course, that feudal period is interesting, but I think especially important if you remember that Japan was the first nation, non-European American nation, the first nation in Asia, Latin America, or the Middle East to modernize and develop nationalism. Some of you who appreciate what nationalism is to strengthen a nation and become dominant, if possible, among your neighbors. And Japan developed then, especially with this idea that Amaterasu Omikami, the god, had sent their emperor, and it was the ancestors of the Japanese, but the ancestors in Japan, and they became then a divine nation, as it were. Japan earlier in the 1300s, as I recall, was attacked by the Mongol fleet, and you've heard of the fleet in about the first few days. It was later wiped out by a wind, by a hurricane or a typhoon. and became then that wind, as you know, was the kamikaze, and the name also given to Japanese suicide pilots during the war that I was involved in the Pacific. So Japan then became industrialized, modernized, and very, very impressive to anybody, especially Asians, who visited Japan to see what was happening. I've had quite a bit of contact with Mongolian scholars. I was in Mongolia for a time, and many of them were educated in Japan and learned what it was like to be a modern nation and to borrow from Japan. Now, it's interesting to me that these samurai suits still attract attention. Here's Darth Vader from Star Wars, and interested in samurais and samurai suits, and it's interesting. So that, I think I've maybe run out of time, but thank you for your attention, and if there are any questions later, I'd be happy to answer them. How do I turn this off? Just leave it?
Okay, there we are. I'd first like to thank all those who have made this exhibit possible, the many, many wonderful people in the Harold B. Lee Library, the kind and generous donors who funded the purchase of some of the items for the exhibit, and the kind and generous members of the community who have loaned items for the exhibit, and the many diligent students who have prepared research, transcription, and translation for the items in the exhibit. I wish I could name every one of you, but then this would sound more like an Oscar acceptance speech than a lecture. So I'll move on. I want to talk about a few of the items on display and the serendipity that brought them together, or as a more wise colleague of mine pointed out, the providence that brought them together for this exhibit. In 1598, after the death of the ruler Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Japan was ruled by a council of elders, and Tokugawa Ieyasu was foremost among them. Ieyasu seized complete control after winning the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, and then was named shogun by the emperor in 1603, becoming the effectual ruler of the country. The Toyotomi assumed rule would pass to Hideyoshi's son Hideyori rather than the Tokugawa, and they eventually built an army in Osaka to challenge the Tokugawa. This month marks the 400th anniversary of the beginning of the Battle of Osaka. After a truce in January of 1615, the Toyotomi not so secretly began preparing for the next battle. The Tokugawa obliged, and for one very bloody week in the summer of 1615, the two sides fought again. This time Ieyasu showed no mercy. The Toyotomi were obliterated, Osaka Castle was burned, and the city of Osaka was overrun by more than 150,000 troops on the Tokugawa side. It may appear that we planned this exhibit to coincide with the 400th anniversary of the Battle of Osaka, and I'd like to say that's the case, but it was not on our radar at all until well into the planning of the exhibit. But the Battle of Osaka has turned out to be something like a hub around which several items in the exhibit seem to turn, just such as the items listed here. I'd like to talk about the last item in this list, the illustration of the summer campaign of the Battle of Osaka. While most other feudal lords in Japan were preparing for battle in Osaka, one was ordered to stay home and guard the castle. Mogami Iechika was a wealthy and powerful domain lord that ruled an area of northern Japan, now part of Yamagata Prefecture. He sent two of his retainers to fight in his stead. After the fighting was over, they commissioned an artist to depict a battle scene to present to their lord Iechika. It thenceforth was called the Mogami screen. The Mogami were a family with some serious issues. Iechika's father, Yoshiaki, didn't get along with Iechika's older brother, Yoshiyasu, the rightful heir, and had him assassinated so Iechika could inherit his title and position. Iechika, in turn, was later assassinated at the age of 37 and replaced by his son Yoshitoshi, who was too young to actually rule and was controlled by some conspiratorial retainers. This classic warrior house succession dispute ended when the Tokugawa shogunate became so alarmed by the situation that they disenfranchised the Mogami clan in 1622, seizing and redistributing their lands and holdings. The Mogami family survived with their lives, but little else. Sometime after the Mogami family were disenfranchised, the Mogami screen left their possession and came into the collection of the Kozenji Temple in Yamagata. Thereafter, it led a double life. Some said that it was a depiction of the Battle of Osaka. Others said that it was a depiction of some other battle in which Mogami Yoshiaki had fought. For right in the middle of the painting is a banner with a stupa, or gravestone image, which was known to be the banner of Yoshiaki. Whatever battle it was the painting depicted, viewers were always impressed by its bloody, raw, and unvarnished view of battle. You see, most paintings of samurai battles were made long after the fact by artists who had not seen the battle, and they often give a romanticized view skewed to the victors, who always seem to be highly organized in their ranks and able to defeat enemies without very much shedding of blood. The Mogami screen was different. It showed the ugliness of battle, the confusion, violent death, blood, gore, severed heads, headless bodies. Furthermore, it showed that many of the participants weren't really samurai at all. Common foot soldiers recruited from the peasant class who not only didn't wear armor, some were half naked as they hacked away at each other, while more appropriately armored samurai watched on. In 1748, a young man who would grow up to be the famous scholar and doctor Sugita Genpaku overheard someone tell his teacher of seeing the Mogami screen. This person specifically mentioned the many soldiers without armor. 52 years later, in the autumn of 1800, Sugita was surprised to be shown a copy of the Mogami screen, which matched the description he had overheard so many years previous. The copy of the Mogami screen that Sugita saw was a copy ordered by the Lord of Kamiyama Castle, Akimoto Tsunetomo, in the autumn of 1799, less than a year before Sugita saw it. This copy is still in the collection of Kamiyama Castle in Yamagata. An inscription on the painting claims that it was the first copy ever to be made of the Mogami screen. It seems that after this point, several copies and copies of copies were made, including the copy now shown in the exhibit here, which was probably painted in the 1840s. It is fortunate so many copies were made because the original painting from 1615 was lost in a fire in 1894. In the spring of this year, we proposed that the library purchase some samurai-related materials for the exhibit. Some generous donors agreed to fund the purchases, and we contacted the seller in Japan only to find out the items we wanted had already been sold. As luck or providence would have it, the seller had some other samurai-related items that were in our price range. One of these was Seiki Shuzu, collected illustrations of banners and standards. This book arrived and was cataloged a few weeks later. Very shortly after this, we had the opportunity to purchase the painting illustration of the summer campaign of the Battle of Osaka. This painting was very exciting for me, and I immediately went to work researching both the image and the historical context. I quickly discovered that our exhibit coincided with the 400th anniversary of the battle. I also discovered that the painting was in fact a copy of the Mogami screen, which I had previously known nothing about. In my research, I happened upon an essay by the Japanese art historian Miyajima Shinichi, in which he attempts to prove that the Mogami screen is in fact a depiction of the Battle of Osaka and not some other battle in which Mogami Yoshiaki had fought. This essay yielded much information for me, but Miyajima's argument Even though he's correct in asserting that it is the Battle of Osaka, his argument is nonetheless only weakly supported. He writes that, quote, "There must have been other samurai in the Battle of Osaka with the same banner image," unquote, and he leaves it at that. Shortly after the Battle of Osaka painting was purchased, but before it arrived, I came to work one morning and thought to myself, I wonder if the books purchased in the spring have been cataloged yet. I should go over to Special Collections and have a look at them so we can start preparing them for the exhibit. They were available, and so I started thumbing through collected illustrations of banners and standards. This book was completed toward the end of April 1800. The author, artist, annotator is Tozawa Morinori. Nothing is known of Tozawa except what information he provides himself, that he is a samurai of the Tozawa clan, which traces its lineage to the Taira clan, and lived in extreme northern Japan. It is clear that Tozawa was a dedicated and accomplished researcher of battle flags. He includes in his collection many rare and unusual banners and battle standards, and ends the collection with a lengthy essay on the subject. Students in my classical Japanese course right now are working on transcribing the essay in preparation for translating it so we can get a better idea of Tozawa's scholarship. So as I'm glancing through this book, I come across this page with a rather long paragraph. Thinking this must be important, I began reading it. And here's a rough translation. In the 6th month of Genna, after successfully attacking Osaka Castle in the province of Setsu, Tokugawa Ieyasu had a painting made that faithfully reproduced the bloody battle that had taken place and gave it to Mogami Yoshiaki. After the Mogami family died out, the painting came into the possession of the Kozenji Temple in Muikamachi, Yamagata, and still resides there. A certain retainer, the Lord of Yamagata, Castle Akimoto, made a copy of this painting, and I begged him to allow me to make a copy. I have illustrated here 2 or 3 banners from within that painting that are a little unusual in form. Now, the information Tozawa cites is not entirely correct. Tokugawa Ieyasu did not commission the painting, nor was it given to Mogami Yoshiaki, who was dead before the Battle of Osaka. It was given to his son. But I realized pretty quickly Tozawa was talking about the Mogami screen. Not just the Mogami screen, but the 1799 copy of it that Sugita Genpaku had seen in the fall of 1800. Tozawa had seen the same copy roughly 6 months before Sugita had seen it. He made his own copy of the copy and then recorded in his book some of the unusual battle standards. What are the chances that a copy of the Mogami screen and this book come to BYU within weeks of each other? The battle standards Tozawa illustrates are indeed those depicted in the Battle of Osaka painting, but there's more. Tozawa annotates the battle standards, identifying their owners. The men whose battle standards he identifies were all from the Mikawa area of modern-day Aichi Prefecture, the birthplace of Tokugawa Ieyasu. All were closely allied with Ieyasu, and all were known to have fought in the Battle of Osaka. Furthermore, Tozawa identifies the owner of the standard with the gravestone not as Mogami, but Kuze Hironobu. This one-of-a-kind, 214-year-old book by an obscure samurai of the late Tokugawa period is the evidence Miyajima needed to prove his point that the Mogami screen is indeed a depiction of the Battle of Osaka. Chills went up and down my spine as I read through Tozawa's book. I've kind of become a geek for all things samurai, and this sort of thing is thrilling to me. I was astounded. What are the chances that this book, produced in northern Japan in 1800, and the Battle of Osaka painting, produced in Tokyo in the 1840s, and the Tale of Osaka, produced in Kyoto in 1672, all so closely knit and mutually enlightening, would come together in an exhibit at BYU in Provo, Utah, 400 years to the very month after the epic Battle of Osaka began. I encourage you to spend time with these wonderful, fascinating items. This is a smallish exhibit, but every single item in the exhibit has an intriguing tale to tell. Thank you for letting me share just one of those tales with you today. There it is.
It's a great pleasure to make a few comments, and I'd like to begin, as Jack did, by thanking a few people. I'd like to thank Dr. Hyer for his contribution, his donation of the armor that really forms the centerpiece of this exhibit. I'd also like to thank Gail and Eric, who have already been mentioned by Russ. It was a great pleasure to work with them. One person who hasn't been mentioned, whose name you'll find on a panel in the exhibit, is Tyler Creer, a former BYU student who's now in a classics PhD program at the University of Virginia, who played a very important role in helping us to understand the armor. If you ever want to learn all that you could possibly learn about samurai armor and weaponry, talk to Tyler. He will never tire of talking about it, and you will never tire of hearing about it. Also, it has been a real great pleasure to work closely with Jack, who has been a wonderful colleague in Japanese studies since I first met him during our first semester as grad students at Columbia University back in 1999. So in short, it's been a great pleasure to work on this exhibit, and I think this year-long exhibit here in the library represents a high point for Japanese studies at BYU. And I should mention that in addition or in conjunction with this exhibit, International Cinema, our great program here at BYU, will be showing a series of samurai films, and there's plenty of great ones to choose from, and quite a few that I think many of you have not seen. And I encourage you to look for those and take advantage of this wonderful opportunity. So as you can see from well, it's actually not very evident from my title, I have been charged with talking about how students assisted with this project in classes that were taught by Jack and myself. And this is really one of the great pleasures of teaching at BYU. We have great students here, great undergraduate students who are capable of doing, in some cases, graduate level work. And Jack and I and the rest of us who've been working in preparing this exhibit have benefited from their interest and their participation in helping us with that. Scholarly work, whether it be literature that Jack teaches or history, which I teach, requires a number of skills. But perhaps if you were to generalize, you could boil them down to two. The first skill is the ability to simply read and understand a source, whether that source be a text or an image, or a combination of both. The second skill is the ability to understand a text or image in its broader context. These two skills or tasks, as signaled by my use of the word understand in both cases, are of course interrelated. By doing one, you can do the other better. They're mutually dependent. And the first, of course, that is being able to read a source, requires linguistic proficiency, which requires a lot of study and experience, especially when you are dealing with a language as challenging as pre-modern Japanese. The second task, that is putting a source or sources in their broader historical context, requires asking a series of basic questions about a text or an image. such as who, when, where, why, and how. And these questions help one to start to make sense out of a text or image, and to connect the source and the information to a broader political, economic, social, and cultural history, and ultimately to come up with an argument that contributes to knowledge, historical knowledge. So the students in Jack's class, his Introduction to Classical Japanese course, were engaged primarily in the first task of deciphering the meaning of the text, and maybe a little bit of the images as well. Yeah, certainly the images. The students in my class, in my early Japanese history course, were focused on the second task of putting a source that they were assigned to work on in its broader historical context. So beginning in the fall of 2012, the students in Jack's 441 course started the arduous task of preparing materials in special collections for display for this exhibit. 7 items were eventually included in the exhibit that they worked on, all of which required some level of preparation. The sort of preparation necessary included background research into authors, artists, and historical context. So you can see how the first task is bleeding into the second. Transcription of handwritten and sometimes cursive, and it's cursive that's even more difficult than my mother's cursive, text to decipher the content of books and pictures, and the translation of the text into English for the label descriptions that you'll see in the exhibit. In order to deal with old handwritten texts, some of which, of course, are nearly 400 years old, students had to learn how to decipher this cursive writing, alternative syllabary forms, and pre-modern character forms. And it's easy to say that, but to actually do it is very difficult. In addition, some of the texts were in a hybrid Chinese-Japanese style, very different from modern spoken Japanese. These are the sort of tasks, as I've suggested earlier, that usually require they're usually required of graduate students at Japanese universities and some American universities. The undergraduate students at BYU stepped up to the plate, and with only little wincing at times, took on a very difficult task that even native Japanese rarely undertake, gaining invaluable experience not available at most universities. So I'd like to show you a few slides that Jack provided me that will help illustrate what these students did. So here's the first one. So this is an item that you will see upstairs, and you can see the Japanese characters here, and they're not easy to read. I am a historian of modern Japan, and I would not be readily able to read all of those characters. So Jack worked with his students in classical Japanese, and it was, I guess, their semester project to work on these, and you can see how they have rendered them into modern Japanese. Here's another example. I don't know is this image upstairs or not? It is? Okay. I chose wisely. So another example of what a student did. And it looks very easy once it's done, but research in Japanese history and literature, even once you've gotten the PhD, often continues to require a dictionary. The level of linguistic difficulty, particularly for this era of time, is quite extraordinary. Here's another example, a different student who's not only provided us with the modern Japanese and how to read that. Here's the modern Japanese for that, how to read it, and how to pronounce it in Romanized form, but also an English definition and a little bit of an explanation, which starts to help one to put this into its historical context. And here's my favorite example. Less technologically sophisticated, but it gets the job done. And I think it shows the effort even better that is required to do this work. So these are some examples from Jack's class. Let's see. So in my class, early Japanese history, I had 18 students this last winter semester. A few of them knew some Japanese, had lived in Japan or served missions in Japan, but most of them had very little Japanese background and very little, and it was really an introductory course on early Japanese history. So they were handicapped. And in some ways, we had to rely on information that Jack students were providing us to try to make some sense of the sources that I assigned them to work with. And we also focused less on the text and more on the images. And we were lucky to have some sources with great images that were wonderfully illustrated. So in the kind of semester assignment for my course was, how I structured it was I put these 18 students into 6 groups of 3. I assigned them a particular source in special collections that we thought would likely be part of the exhibit. And I made those assignments according to the interests that they expressed. And then I asked each of these groups to put the source, to try to put the source in its broader historical context. And then I asked each group to summarize their research in the form of a poster that they were not just going to show me, but had to show the world, or at least the segment of the world that showed up for the Mary Lou Fulton Mentored Research Conference that is held each year in my college, that is the College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences, that takes place every spring. And if you haven't had a chance to visit one of those, I urge you to do so. There's some great work that comes out of that. Also, after the poster was complete, each individual student individually had to produce a research paper that was in large part based on the research they had done as a group. So let me show you a few slides of their work. Actually, all 6 groups' slides our posters are here. So this one deals with this gun scroll, and I thought this group did a great job contextualizing this. We don't have a lot of time to spend on each of these, so I'll just go through them fairly quickly, but you'll get some idea of the work that's involved. Here's one that deals with a book illustrating the Battle of Osaka. We didn't have the scroll that Jack talked about, or the painting, I should say. Here's one. This scroll is of a procession from Ryukyu, that is modern-day Okinawa, that a group worked on. Unfortunately, thematically, this scroll didn't fit in with our exhibit. So you will not see it other than just right now. And then here's one that deals with the book of banners that Jack mentioned. Here's one that deals with the sword scroll. I think you'll see, I don't know if you, yeah, this page upstairs. I've been gone for the last week and a half to Japan, so I only saw the exhibit very briefly this morning in its final form. And here is one that actually won first place in the history department that deals with the Hipuzukai, yeah. So I can't remember how we rendered this into English. Soldier's Illustrated Guide, yeah. So that has quite a bit of visual impact, wouldn't you say? Yeah. So as Jack and I curated this exhibit, we greatly benefited from the work of these students, and I'm happy that many of them are here to see how their work in these classes not only helped them to learn some new skills, but also contributed to the preparation of the exhibit. As I mentioned, their contribution is acknowledged on a panel in the exhibit. It's kind of in a corner. Initially I missed it and I wondered if it was actually there, but it is there in a corner. Your 15 seconds of fame, students. But while it's acknowledged, I'd also like to invite all the students who were involved to please stand so that we can recognize them. Yeah, right up your hand. Thank you.